Welcome to the Liberty and Leadership Podcast, a conversation with TFAS alumni, faculty, and friends who are making an impact today. I'm your host, Roger Ream. Today, I'm excited to welcome Eric J. Tanenblatt to the Liberty and Leadership Podcast. Eric is the Global Chair of Public Policy and Regulation at Dentons Law Firm. For over 3 decades, he has worked at the highest levels of federal and state government, including serving in 3 presidential administrations. Eric's commitment to civic engagement includes working with the Corporation for National and Community Service and the National Conference for Service and Volunteerism. He is the founder of Hands On Georgia and has been recognized as one of Georgia's 100 most influential persons and was one of the state's 40 under 40 rising stars. I'm pleased to share that Eric is an alumnus of the Fund for American Studies class of 1987, and over the years has maintained a supportive relationship with us. He serves on our Board of Trustees and led our 50th anniversary campaign. A man who certainly leads by example, Eric models the many qualities that TFAS encourages its students to emulate. Because of this, TFAS presented its 2024 Alumni Achievement Award to Eric at this year's 34th Annual Scholarship Dinner. Eric, welcome and thank you for joining me.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
If I could start, close to the beginning, which is 1987, when you attended our Economics and Public Policy track, which was at that time the Institute on Comparative Political and Economic Systems. Could you tell me how you first heard about our program while a student at Emory University?
Yeah, it's hard to believe that was over 35 years ago, but I was looking to do something different during the summer of my junior year. So I guess it was in the fall of my junior year, I started to explore what opportunities were out there. And I went into the Emory Career Planning and Placement Center, and they gave me a book, and it was filled with various programs and opportunities. And I started perusing the book and saw the brochure for TFAS and for the Institute on Comparative Political and Economic Systems, was intrigued, didn't tell my parents or anyone, and I just applied and got in. And that's how it happened.
They probably don't have that book anymore, but I'm sure they've got a lot of online resources.
That's right.
And hopefully we're in there. Share some memorable experiences from that summer in 1987 when you spent it in Washington, D.C. with us.
Well, it was a life-changing experience for me because it really set me on a path that I ultimately pursued from a career standpoint to pursue a career in government policy and politics. I didn't know what to expect when I got to Washington. I'd always been involved in student government and was always intrigued by government and politics, but never really worked in or around government and politics. And being in Washington, D.C., it was all around me. And through the TFAS program, we had these unique opportunities to see things that most people don't get to see. And I remember going to the House floor and Congressman Newt Gingrich, this is before he was in leadership, spoke to us on the floor of the House. Just being in the House chambers alone was we were all pretty much in awe. I remember going to a lunch that we were all invited to at the Washington Hilton, and Ronald Reagan spoke. And for a young kid to see the president of the United States, especially Ronald Reagan, and at the Washington Hilton, which has historic significance with regards to Ronald Reagan. And I remember when he walked out, he walked right by our table. And it was definitely an aha moment for me.
Yeah, that's really neat. It's still an aha moment when students happen to see even the presidential motorcade go by or something like that. In what sense did the TFAS experience influence your career trajectory?
Well, after that summer, I had decided that I really thought that this was a a path that I wanted to pursue. And it was the fall of 1987. So that was the start of the 1988 presidential election. And so I decided that during my senior year, I was going to get involved in a presidential election, and I researched all the candidates that were running. And the candidate that I, saw was most aligned with where I was George H.W. Bush, who at the time was the vice president. So I made contact with his campaign leadership in Georgia, and I said, I want to volunteer on the campaign. And they got me involved. The vice president did his Southeastern announcement in Atlanta, and I helped get a bunch of Emory students to volunteer and help with that event. And then they gave me another task of organizing organizations for the vice president on college campuses throughout Georgia. And then I had, because of my summer at TFAS, I actually had enough credits to graduate after my first semester. So the Bush campaign asked me if I wanted a full-time job that January prior to I guess we had a Super Tuesday primary in March. And so I started out organizing telephone banks for the campaign. And then about a month later, they sent me out in the field, and I was assigned a congressional district and got involved in the presidential race. And then ultimately, when President Bush won, was invited to serve in his administration. And so it all sort of took off from there, and it started that summer of 87.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that the credits you got at the TFAS program helped you graduate early, and that sounds like it made a big difference in enabling you to get to work in the primary and in the campaign. You of course took the economics and government classes we offer. In any way, did those courses or your TFAS participation influence or provide any help to you in your now jobs with 3 presidents, a U.S. senator, the governor of Georgia? If in any way did this help prepare you for those career opportunities?
Absolutely. Because you're in Washington for the summer, and it's an intense period, you're doing so much in 6 weeks. And it was unlike my experience at Emory, during the semesters I was there, because this was really an intense focus on, comparative political and economic systems. And, we were constantly debating issues, talking about issues, and it exposed me to things in a way that I wasn't exposed to in my political science classes at Emory. And that really helped me as, I entered my career. My first job in the Bush administration was actually at the Department of Health and Human Services in their legislative affairs. And because of, the experiences I had over the summer at TFAS and friends that worked on Capitol Hill, I had some knowledge of the legislative process. And then I went to the Peace Corps and worked under the director of the Peace Corps doing congressional and intergovernmental affairs. But the Peace Corps is an agency that, sends Americans overseas. So the international exposure, while it was just over the summer, was definitely helpful. And it was actually during, I was working at the Peace Corps during the Gulf War. And so that was interesting too, because you were dealing with a lot of international challenges. President Bush, built a strong alliance. A lot of the allies that, were part of that alliance were countries we talked about during the summer of 87. So it was all of that was very helpful, and it's been helpful throughout my career.
Well, now in 2004, you had the opportunity to coordinate and participate in the G8 Economic Summit. And you've mentioned that over your shoulder is a picture that shows the participants in the summit. Tell me what that was like. And that was in Georgia, wasn't it? Was it in Sea Island?
It was in Sea Island, Georgia. That was really meaningful for a number of reasons. First of all, in 2000, I played a leadership role in then Governor Bush, then President George W. Bush's campaign in Georgia. And so the G8 summit in 2004 was hosted by President Bush. But I was also the chief of staff to Sonny Perdue, who was the first Republican governor in Georgia since Reconstruction. And while I was the chief of staff to the governor, we really made our case as to why President Bush should select Sea Island to host the G8 Economic Summit. So I was actually part of the lobbying team, lobbying the White House to select Georgia. And then once it was selected, Governor Perdue asked me to serve as the state coordinator. So I worked with the federal government, the State Department, the White House, on all of the preparations leading up to the actual summit, and was actually down on Sea Island during the summit. And I mean, that is a unique experience when you have at the time, the 8 world leaders, plus the host of the summit gets to invite other world leaders, if he chooses, to the summit. And so there were Middle Eastern leaders, African leaders, and they all converged on Georgia. And I remember one of the roles that Governor Perdue played, along with Senator Saxby Chambliss, who is our United States Senator, was to greet the world leaders when they landed at Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah. So we had all the world leaders, we had arrival ceremonies, and they helicoptered to Sea Island. So it was definitely a memorable experience. Every time I go down to Sea Island, they have a room that's dedicated to the G8 summit. So I go in there and I see all the memorabilia from the summit. So it was quite a memorable experience, and was just really honored to have been part of it.
Now, we have several of our TFAS alums who are in the governor's office today, including the chief of staff to the governor of Georgia. You were a chief of staff to a governor. What's that like?
It's an important job. It's probably the most difficult job I ever had. For me, it was somewhat unique because, as I mentioned, Sonny Perdue was the first Republican governor in 135 years. So if you have one party dominance for that long of a period of time, and then a new party comes in, you're transitioning all of state government. And so in addition to dealing with that, we also had divided government. We had a democratically controlled House. Governor Perdue, because of his previous service in the state Senate, was able to get 4 of his former Democratic colleagues to switch parties. So the Republicans took control of the state Senate. An issue that was one of several in that gubernatorial race was the previous changing of the state flag by the previous governor that created some angst among a lot of Georgians for not feeling like they had a say in it. So we also had to deal with the lingering issues surrounding the flag, which ultimately led to the changing of the flag to the current Georgia flag. So the combination of the transition of government, divided government, the flag issue, and I should probably also mention, we inherited a $1.65 billion budget deficit. So wow. That one year I was his chief of staff felt like a dog year, felt like 7 years. But it was probably while it was the most difficult, it was probably the most rewarding job that I've ever had.
Well, Georgia seemed to play an outsized role in the last presidential election. I imagine you're being inundated right now with commercials on television and all sorts of political activity leading up to our election in November. In fact, I know it for a fact because my daughter lives in Cumming, Georgia, and she can't wait she says, I wish we weren't a swing state, because of all the political advertising. But do you expect it to be a smooth election this time around? Or if it's close, there'll be the usual controversy about the procedures or something?
I hope it's a smooth election. I mean, everything's in place for it to be a smooth election. And, in 2020, it was also a smooth election. There were challenges, but all of those were investigated and found that there was no credibility to the challenges. And the state legislature actually has taken action over the last 4 years to really make the elections even more bulletproof. Look, elections are never completely perfect, but I do believe that the state has done a very effective job. I'm sure that there'll be, as with every election, there's going to be some questions raised. I hope there's not an organized effort if the outcome isn't the way someone would like it to be. But it's been interesting in Georgia because, when I first got involved 35 plus years ago, Georgia had elected Republicans in the presidential race, and over the last 30 years, we've been more of a right-leaning state, especially at the federal level. Bill Clinton did defeat George Bush in '92, but that was really because of Ross Perot. But every other presidential election, from George Bush, George W. Bush, Bob Dole, John McCain, Mitt Romney, they all carried the state. And it wasn't until 2020 that Joe Biden carried Georgia. And unfortunately, because of some of the challenges and some people being so focused on the outcome of the November 2020 election, it suppressed the vote in the runoff that we had in January 2021. And Republicans lost 2 Senate seats. And now with 2 Democratic senators who have their own state organizations, one of whom, Senator Warnock, got reelected 2 years ago. And the demographics in Georgia have changed. It's become we're much more purple. And you could see from the polls that, the more recent polls that, we're tied and the 2 candidates are tied in the state. So I think it's going to be a very close election, and it's going to all go down, get down to who can turn out their voters.
Well, shifting a little to your current position at Dentons, you're with the world's largest law firm as the global chair of public policy and regulation. Could you talk about what that job involves?
Sure. I mean, I lead a practice group of lawyers and professionals that really focus at the intersection of business, government, and law. And they assist companies, organizations that have issues with the government. And we do that at all levels of government. So we have a large team in Washington, D.C. that focuses on the federal government. We have people across the country that focus on state government. We also do work at the local level with large municipalities. We have an attorneys general practice that works with state attorneys general across the country. And we have a public affairs practice that really looks at communications because, in the public policy world, one thing that I've seen over the last 3 decades that has changed is that there's a lot more involvement on the part of the media, grassroots, coalition building. So we have a team of people in our group that focuses on that. And that's in the U.S. And then every country is different in terms of public policy and the role that outside consultants or law firms play. And so, our firm has set up with different regions. So in each region, there's a leader. And so as the global chair, I coordinate all the leaders around the globe in my global capacity. So I have a global role, but my primary role is the head of the U.S. practice.
Now, you've written about autonomous vehicles over the past several years and have become somewhat of an expert in the legal aspects of that technology. From everything I've read, the use of technology and autonomous vehicles will dramatically reduce the number of car accidents, but there's a thorny issue involving the insurance and liability issues. Do you expect that will somehow be worked out in a way that we can expect autonomous vehicles to flourish in the future?
I do. It'll be a little bit ugly at first, working all of this out. But you raise a really good point about safety. Right now, 85 to 90% of accidents that occur is because of human error. And one of the things that autonomous vehicles will do is it'll take away that human error. And so I do think that safety will improve. Now, you'll have a period of time where you're going to have people driving cars and these autonomous vehicles. And I'm sure that there will be accidents, and I'm sure the individuals that may be responsible will blame the machines as opposed to taking responsibility for it. But, there's a lot that has occurred in the last 7 years in the autonomous vehicle space. At the states typically have responsibility for regulating the drivers, and the cars regulations come from the federal government. The problem with autonomous vehicles, or the challenge, I should say, is that the cars become the drivers. So we have we still do a lot of this is being regulated at the state level. The federal government has been late to the party. That has changed in the last several years. There has been efforts, some fits and starts, in trying to get Congress to pass laws to, put a legislative framework together. I think the DOT is playing a much bigger role, the U.S. DOT, in regulating autonomous vehicles. But we still have a ways to go. That look, the people, it's fear of the unknown, and I think the testing that's taking place. There's a lot of municipalities right now where you're seeing robo-taxis that are on the road. I think all of that stuff is good because the more people can experience it, ride in an autonomous shuttle, ride in a robo-taxi, will make it a lot easier as society as a whole moves to autonomous passenger vehicles. And I also, one last thing, because as you can tell, we could have a whole podcast on this topic, but I do think younger people tend to not want cars these days. They want to use, whether it's public transportation, Uber, or ride sharing, and autonomous vehicles, I think, will, be part of that ecosystem that you're going to see younger people gravitate to. And I think at some point, the Ubers of today will be autonomous fleet vehicles that will just be traveling around cities, circulating, picking people up, dropping them off. And, electric vehicles have a lot longer shelf life, or can last a whole lot longer than a combustible engine vehicle.
Are there some countries in the world that are further along in adopting that technology?
Sure. You're starting to see China. There's some places in Europe that have been at the forefront. The UK has been doing testing. I think that you see it in Australia and Singapore. But the U.S. is still a leader in technology, and you see a lot of activity in the United States, and I think we'll be at the forefront of it. We just got to work through some of the regulatory hurdles, and also the United States, unlike some of other countries, we tend to be a more litigious society, and because you're dealing with liability issues, as you mentioned, I think that may slow us down a little bit, but I think it'll ultimately get worked out.
Well, that's your job there, Eric, to solve those problems along with your colleagues in the legal profession. Tell me about your work. And I know in the Buckhead community, you're a leader there. And I think I've seen you quoted in news stories about things in Buckhead. I saw recently a report I think you posted about the drop in the crime rate. Tell us more about what you do in Buckhead as a leader there.
Yeah, so Buckhead is part of the city of Atlanta, and it's the northern part of the city, and it's a unique area in that it's a mix of residential, commercial, and there's a lot of tourist hotels. And I'm a member of an organization called the Buckhead Coalition. I actually am finishing my 2-year term as chair, and we focus on improving the quality of life for businesses, residents, and visitors in the Buckhead area. When I took over as chairman, and this I think gets to your point about crime, coming out of COVID, as most metropolitan cities across the country, there was a spike in crime, and Atlanta was not immune to that. And so all across the city of Atlanta, crime spiked, including Buckhead. And it actually birthed the movement by some that has now, fortunately, has gone away, but of wanting to take Buckhead out of the city of Atlanta and turn it into its own city, which I think would be a big mistake. And we, city of Atlanta, elected a new mayor, Andre Dickens, who has done a really tremendous job. And when he came into office, one of the top priorities for him was to bring down the crime rate throughout the city, but in particular in Atlanta. Buckhead historically has always had the lowest crime rate in the city of Atlanta. And we knew that even though there was a spike as a result of COVID, we could get those numbers back down. And working with the police department, the police chief, the mayor, and leaders in the city council, and working with the state as well, we were able to do that. And now Buckhead again leads the city of Atlanta in the drop in crime. The whole city has seen a drop in crime. And Buckhead is once again flourishing, and it is a great place to live, work, and raise a family. So anyone watching this podcast, I invite you to come to Buckhead.
It is a beautiful, beautiful part of that Atlanta. You've served in important roles in promoting philanthropy, voluntary service, public service. You've both at the national level as well in Atlanta, as I mentioned in my introduction. And your service in Buckhead is one aspect of that. But it seems to me that one trend that's been a little disturbing over the last, maybe 20 to 30 years is that people more regularly turn to government when there's a problem in a community. Let's get Washington, D.C., especially, to try to solve that. And many of the solutions can be found at home through citizens working voluntarily in their communities to solve those problems. Could you talk some about the work you've done in this area, both in your service nationally, as well as whether you think this trend to move everything to Washington to be solved can be slowed down or stopped?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because it's actually, I don't want to say a crisis, but there's actual data that shows that volunteerism in general is on the decline. And that's really unfortunate. I've always had a passion for civic engagement. I think it's part of our duty as citizens, as Americans, going back to when the country was founded and neighbors help neighbors, whether it was raising a barn or working in faith-based organizations, helping your neighbor. And so I have been engaged in civic activity, even going back to when I was a little kid, and more recently had the honor of being appointed by President Bush to serve on the board of the Corporation for National and Community Service, which is the largest grant-making organization in the federal government for the AmeriCorps program. And to your point about government, AmeriCorps is actually a unique program. Most people don't realize it because it's a public-private partnership. So the federal government just provides some of the funding, but it has to be matched at the state and local level. So it's actually a 17-to-1 return on investment for the federal government. And so I think there's a role that government can play to be a catalyst for programs like AmeriCorps. But I do think that there's more that individual citizens can do, nonprofits can do, that corporations can do, working with local nonprofits, so that we're not so dependent on government. I now sit on the board of Points of Light. That was something that was founded by President George H.W. Bush, which is really interesting because it comes full circle. Because as I mentioned earlier, that was the first person I worked for, out of college, was the Bush administration, and he saw that everyone can be a point of light. Everyone can do something to help their community, and I, really believe that that's something that we all, it's an obligation that all of us, need to take seriously. And I'm hoping that we can change the trend in volunteerism, and more people will get involved helping their community.
At this year's, at our annual scholarship dinner, you are awarded our TFAS Alumni Achievement Award, and it's an alumni-initiated process that puts forward the names of our alumni, and we were so pleased to give it to you this summer, Eric. And could you talk a little bit to our alumni and current students about what it means to be an effective, courageous leader and what kind of leadership lessons you might offer?
Well, first, I want to thank TFAS and those that selected me. That was a real honor because as I hope to have demonstrated in our conversation, TFAS was really influential in my life and the career that I pursued and what I do every day. So to be acknowledged by the organization was really meaningful. Look, I have been very fortunate throughout my career to have had tremendous mentors, and to students and future students. I hope that you are afforded the same opportunity. I was taught at a very early on in my career by probably the person that was the most influential was the late U.S. Senator Paul Coverdale, who I started working for him when he was director of the Peace Corps, and then worked for him in the United States Senate. And one of the things he taught me was that it's really important to listen, and that while you may not always agree with someone, you will likely learn something from listening. And I think that was something that has always stayed with me. And that's something that I have used throughout my whole career and in positions of leadership, because I think it's easy to lead people when you understand the people that you're leading, and the people that you're leading feel respected. And one way that people feel respected is to have someone listen to them. One of the other expressions or things he used to say a lot is that the competition of ideas is a good thing, that when you have a competition of ideas, the best ideas bubble up to the top. And it's unfortunate that, we're living in a time that is very divisive. People tend to be in their own corner, listen to what they want to hear, and we're not doing a lot of listening. And I think we as a nation can do a whole lot better if we were doing a lot more listening. So I guess that would be what I would want to convey to current students and others that are listening.
Well, that's excellent. I agree wholeheartedly, and at our orientation program each summer for students, I emphasize the importance of listening, that you do learn more from listening than just by talking. And I picked this up somewhere that I like to say to them: God endowed us with 2 ears and 1 mouth and expects us to use them proportionally. And, it's something I emphasize too in our fundraising team at TFAS, the importance of listening, because when you go visit with a supporter, we want to hear what they think, what kinds of things they're trying to accomplish. And that's the way in any sales position, whether it's fundraising or selling a product. You want to listen to your customer to learn what it is they're trying to accomplish. So, well, Eric, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I know you keep a very busy schedule, and you're often not only in Washington, D.C., but probably traveling the globe on Denton's business and other work you're doing. We're proud to call you a TFAS alum. Thank you for your service on our board of trustees as well. It's very valuable there, and appreciate you being with me this morning.
Well, thank you. And I always have time for TFAS.
Thank you for listening to the Liberty and Leadership Podcast. If you have a comment or question, please drop us an email at podcast@tfas.org. And be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app and leave a 5-star review. Liberty and Leadership is produced at Podville Media. I'm your host, Roger Ream, and until next time, show courage in things large and small.